It's not even the whole thing. Just the turret. And like, honestly, the mind boggles. He has he gets given a military medal, which is one of the sort of the bravery medals in the British Army, because he's in a British tank unit fighting in Burma. But after the war, he gets to keep he keeps the sword. And it's now in Edinburgh Castle. So if anyone goes to Edinburgh Castle, to the Scots Dragoon Guards museum, you can actually find that and a silk one of those silk flags that the guys used to get their family members to write messages on. That was off the same guy's body. They're both in the museum there, the regimental museum. If anyone's in Edinburgh, I recommend that. But it's an amazing, amazing story. And also things like, I've got in Thunder Run, I talk about the time where, like they literally charge I say rugby, but, if you think about like an American footballer charging through the line, like literally just a Japanese guy jumps out from a bush, charges like an American football player through some infantry who kind of don't quite clock what's going on, and he dives underneath a tank and blows himself up. Yeah. It's just you can't. I find it hard to comprehend it. I've studied this for quite a few years now. Like, it shows you just how powerful the sort of the Bushido, the way of the warrior, and so on, that was instilled in the brutalization of Japanese soldiers. And what's so fascinating, you talked about the Japanese Superman myth earlier, and also the savagery that goes alongside that. Soldiers see it as savagery in a way. But at the beginning of the war, they're scared of the Japanese for all of this. Yes. But, one of the guys I follow quite closely, Lieutenant Colonel Miles Smeaton, who's the commander of 5th Probing's Horse, who is on the Thunder Run. By the time of this battle, he pities the Japanese. He said something like, their anguished look of determination was something we couldn't comprehend, but we did pity. And it's that journey, that mental, psychological journey that the soldiers have been through, from ultimate fear of the Japanese to feeling sorry for them by the end, because of the resort to suicide tactics against tanks. And the thing is, the suicide bombs are not that powerful, so a lot of the time the Shermans are repairable when they're back in action. It's horrible for the crews, and British soldiers and Indian tank drivers and so on die. But it's a wasting asset at the end of the day, and it's just for the Japanese losing their infantry like this, and it's not doing enough damage to justify it, to be honest. But their artillery isn't good enough. Their anti-tank artillery is not good enough.
And it comes down. It's so ironic given the battles they have on the frontiers of Manchuria with the USSR. The Kwangtung Army highlighted the issues that they faced, and anti-tank warfare was one of them. But
it's a problem in 1939 for them. At the end of the day, and the thing is, even the solution to the problem is wrong. The British 6-pounder anti-tank gun that first comes in North Africa, which is reasonably good. I mean, it's the 17-pounder is what's needed later in the war, but it's the same as the American 57mm anti-tank gun. And to be honest, by 1944, the 57mm, the British 6-pounder, is only just good enough against, say, the Panzer IV. But really, you need something bigger for Panthers and Tigers and so on. The Japanese never go above 47mm in anti-tank guns. And it's not good enough. It's good enough for a Stuart tank at the beginning of the war, or at the beginning of the Pacific campaign, but it is not good enough against a Sherman at the end of the day. And there are lots of reasons for that. The American bombing campaign, the submarine blockade that stops both raw materials coming in, but also finished products leaving to supply places. All those famous pictures of Japanese tanks that are now diving spots on sunken ships in Pacific archipelagos. That's the point of doing all this, is that so that they're not at the front line. So that they don't have an impact. It sucks to be you if you're facing a Japanese tank and you don't have an anti-tank weapon yourself, but there aren't many of them in comparison to how many the British and Indian Army are bringing to the battle.
No, only very rare occurrences in some Pacific islands, very rare. And of course, in the China theater. In the China theater, the Japanese tank does reign supreme because it doesn't really have competition, and it does adequately against the more lightly armed Chinese, who resort to suicide tactics similar to what the Japanese use. So there's a dichotomy between the Chinese and Japanese with the suicide squads. It's horrifying. But yeah, the Japanese at this point, they have no answer yet again to tanks in Burma, and I don't think
Mm.
they expected there to be much armored warfare in Burma. So don't blame them for that. But
Yeah, I mean, it's like you're saying that is that I talk about this in the Forgotten Armor. One of the reasons why tanks are so decisive at places like Imphal and at Kohima at the Battle of the Tennis Court is because the British put supreme efforts into putting tanks, using things like the Royal Engineers, the Indian Engineers. They put a huge amount of effort to get tanks there because they know it's an advantage that the Japanese can do nothing about. The thing that I talk about in Forgotten Armor is the Battle of the Tennis Court is 16 days of horrific siege by the Royal West Kents, the Assam Rifles, and so on. I'm from Kent in the southeast of England, the bit that's closest to France, the bottom right-hand corner. And so one of my reasons I'm interested in the Burma campaign is because I'm from West Kent, and it was the Royal West Kents who fought at Kohima. Theoretically, if I was drafted or if I'd volunteered and I ended up in the 4th Battalion of the Royal West Kents, I'd have been at Kohima. That would have been my story, if I was there. And that's always been my sort of link to it, and the war memorial in the place that I grew up had soldiers who were killed at Kohima and so on. And so that's kind of like my origin story to the Burma campaign. But what happens is they hold the tennis court for 16 days. Then there's another 23 days when they're relieved and the 2nd British Division then take over, famously the 2nd Dorsets. So Dorset is on the south coast of England near the Isle of Wight, just west of the Isle of Wight. The Dorsets push the Japanese or fight the Japanese for 23 days. Over 100 Dorsets die in those 23 days. The Royal West Kents lose dozens and dozens as well. And it's 39 days in total. When they bring the tank up on the 13th of May, by a hero of mine, Jerry Waterhouse is the tank commander, they get his tank on there in 80 minutes. 39 days in 80 minutes, that one tank is the only difference, and that's how they clear the tennis court. Him methodically just destroying Japanese bunkers one by one with the 75mm gun on his Grant tank. He's an M3 medium Grant. And it's not just that it's over in 80 minutes, they lose one guy dead in the whole operation from the doors, the infantry that support. The infantry lose one guy. And that's the difference a tank makes. 39 days, over 100 dead, hundreds more wounded, hundreds of dead Japanese, 80 minutes, one tank, one dead. Amazing.
Of course. And then, of course, in the island hopping warfare, it's the fire tank over everything that makes it turns out to be the most efficient killer, if not just putting gasoline in cave openings and then letting it on fire, basically, is what most of the battles end up being. But
and that does happen, and that happens in Burma as well. They have to resort to the same thing where the Japanese burrow into some of the hills, like Mandalay Hill is a good example of that. It shows you the extremes that you have to go to because the Japanese don't surrender particularly.
Yeah, actually, a lot of the tactics the Japanese use for using the terrain and digging into things, the Viet Cong will famously use a lot of these tactics later in the Vietnam Wars. It's very similar. Yeah,
there's a fascinating moment as well in I don't know if you're aware of it, but in 1946, the British and French actually rearm Japanese prisoners.
Yeah. Yes, I know.
As well. Yeah, like real minder messes with your mind thinking of that.
Yeah, all the independence movements you see in Southeast Asia, they're very complicated because you could argue they were fomented by the Japanese, sometimes against the Japanese because of how brutal they were to the people there, but they get aimed at who are the former allies during World War II. So a lot of Japanese commanders find themselves in unique positions in Southeast Asia where their expertise is used by different groups. Yeah,
absolutely.
I was actually wondering, so for as far as the battle for Meiktila is concerned, what do you think? Do you have any personal stories or anything you've come across from, individuals and all that?
Yeah, there's a couple of really amazing ones. I mean, so the Battle of Meiktila can be split into, once they've got to Meiktila, so the Thunder Run is this charging across the desert and so on and surrounding the town. But then what they do is there's the fight to capture it, which lasts about 4 days. Then there's a couple of weeks of the armoured sweeps that I mentioned. And then there's another 2 weeks really where the fight is all about a duel over the airfield, because the airfield becomes the focus because that's where all the supplies are coming in. Yeah.